It's the week ending Saturday the 23rd of April, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Russia banning Boris Johnson from entering the country due to his stance on the war, the value of Netflix decreasing by $50 billion, and Her Majesty the Queen celebrating her 96th birthday. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. Joining me today from the week's digital team is Joe Evans and Kate Samuelson, plus it's our favourite nutty professor, science correspondent for The Economist, Alok Jha. And I'm sure that's one of his favourite films too. Joe, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
The return of an old enemy.
ISIS can't withstand the onslaught and loses more than a fifth of its territory. But in response, it begins launching increasingly spectacular terror attacks abroad in Tunisia, Kuwait, Sinai, and then Paris. And so-called lone wolves, inspired by ISIS propaganda, also launch attacks, though they're often amateurish and less effective. Eventually, ISIS will lose its state. It is simply too weak, has no allies or outside funders, and is surrounded by enemies. But ISIS will respond by reverting to what it was before as Al-Qaeda in Iraq, an insurgency and a terror group still capable of horrifying violence. And in that form, it could be around for years.
The Rise of ISIS in 6 minutes, a video from Vox. So, Joe, ISIS, I remember them. What have they been up to this week then?
Yes, so as you rightly point out, Ollie, you probably haven't heard from ISIS in quite a long time, but this week their followers have been urged to wage a new global offensive against Europe and Israel in response to the recent death of their leader. In an announcement timed to coincide with Ramadan, the group's new spokesperson told would-be jihadists that they should attempt to stage terror attacks while the Crusaders are fighting each other, in reference to the Ukraine invasion. In an audio message that was shared widely on Telegram, it was suggested that non-Muslim nations are currently preoccupied with Russia's aggression in Europe and that this is a great opportunity for Islamic State to strike.
I suppose fair point, isn't it, Kate? If you're Islamic State, it's true. The eyes of the world are diverted. But, you know, in propaganda terms, they would be telling their followers that anyway. Do you think they really do have an opportunity here?
Certainly, it's true that people are distracted by the war that's going on in Ukraine right now. But actually, a lot of security experts have seen this kind of call to attack as more of a sign of desperation than something to truly fear. A recent report by the UN Security Council found that the deaths of leading ISIS terrorists, like the ISIS leader who was killed by US forces in Syria in February, and the desertion of thousands of fighters from the group has really left ISIS in quite a weakened position. And some say that it's no longer capable of organizing really sophisticated attacks in the West and have to instead rely on more lone wolf tactics.
I mean, Alok, do you think it was naive of people in the West, in governments, to refer to them almost as a spent force, to think of them as a thing from 5-10 years ago? Or actually, you know, as I was suggesting, they've always used social media for propaganda purposes. So, you know, this isn't anything to get too worried about.
I think that there's no clear-cut answer to that, but my feeling is that it's more likely to be what you're suggesting, which is that ISIS needs publicity. It's all about attention, and it hasn't got any. And as Kate said, it feels like a sign of desperation to be calling out to who are the people listening. It's going to be lone wolves. It's going to be, for example, the person who killed David Ames last year. That kind of single-minded, single-person, unplanned, attack, and that was a horrifying attack on a sitting MP. But it's not the scale of the terror attacks that we've seen that these organizations are capable of, and it goes right back to 20, 30 years ago, when with the roots of ISIS, which is Al Qaeda. So Al Qaeda was this sort of group in Asia, but then it just sort of sent out messages to say whoever wants to be sort of allied to us can do so independently. And it wasn't much of a force back then, but then things did get worse. So my point is that it wants attention, it wants followers, and it can only do that by this sort of announcement. It's not something to ignore, however.
I mean, from that point of view, Joe, the reference to Israel is interesting, isn't it? They're encouraging people to take out attacks on Europe and America, which you'd sort of expect, and Israel, which you'd sort of expect in propaganda terms. But I just wonder whether that's a sort of easy one to claim, because there are frequent attacks in Israel, aren't there? There's sectarian violence there. It's easy to then say, oh, yeah, we did that one. Whereas actually, it luckily hasn't been happening in Europe recently.
Absolutely. It is a while since we've seen a major attack in Europe. As you also rightly point out, there has been a string of ISIS-affiliated, at least, attacks in Israel throughout March and early April. The reason for the call for attacks on Jerusalem and Israel specifically is that previously ISIS's position has been that Jerusalem can only be liberated through the return of the Islamic State Caliphate. The Islamic State's Caliphate is in a pretty sort of bloody and battered state, really. It's lost most of its territory across the Middle East. In the last few years has been targeting Africa as an area to sort of stage a new jihadist battleground. And it's been doing that in much the same way that sort of Alok referred to before, in terms of creating these sort of affiliate links. It's forged alliances with lots of local militant groups in a sort of symbiotic relationship that pump up their profiles, fundraising and recruitment, but that actually does just sort of further this image of a slightly sort of unstable, tentacle-like organization that doesn't actually really have any sort of central ideological goal or kind of central organization.
The idea here is to project power, isn't it? I mean, it was a decade ago a sort of terrifying, powerful organization in response to largely American-led attacks in the Middle East, and it did some horrible things. And it wants to project that power to attract followers. Right now, it's got no attention, so it's going to attract no followers. And I think that that's all this is. But the caution I would make is that in the last decade, whilst the West was focused on fighting ISIS in the Middle East, Russia was ignored in many respects and welcomed into the international fold, and sort of all its intransigences just sort of ignored in some respects. It grew in power, and you can perhaps argue that Vladimir Putin got a bit pissed off that he didn't have such an important sort of bogeyman role for the West. And you can see what's happening now in Ukraine, that horrible war. So, what I'm saying is that, ISIS is on its knees right now, and, surely Western forces, intelligence agencies, and so on should not ignore the fact that these organizations exist in however many small numbers, because you don't know what's going to happen in 10 years' time as they build up.
Well, also, I suppose, Kate, you can't kill the idea. And that was always the problem with the war on terror as a principle, wasn't it? You can kill the leaders, you can take back the territory that they've established or seized, but you can't really kill an idea. It is an ideological movement based on an interpretation of the Quran. The Quran still exists, that interpretation still exists, the idea underpinning IS still exists, even if all the people have gone.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I completely agree with Alok that while the risks might not be as great as they would potentially like us to feel, we can't get complacent. And actually, the group is growing in places like Iraq and Syria, and trying to build a greater capacity in places like that. And, we've seen a rise in ambushes. There were things like the massive prison break in northeast Syria in January. All this does show that we should definitely be taking ISIS seriously.
So, Joe, what is your view as a kind of general health check on IS then, whilst everyone is looking elsewhere?
I think earlier you said that perhaps we'd been slightly naive in describing IS as a spent force. And I think actually possibly what this call to arms and what the war in Ukraine has evidenced is perhaps that we were slightly naive for a long time about the threat of Islamist terrorism to an extent. I think more Russians and Ukrainians have died in 6 weeks of fighting in Central Europe than all of the losses of British and American forces in 2 decades in the Middle East fighting against Islamist terrorism. I think what it evidences is that while we have been preoccupied with this threat for 2 decades, the larger threat, as Alok referred to earlier, is still from individual rogue nation states rather than through insurgent groups. Having said that, I think it's also evident that intelligence services and security forces on a national level still do need to remain vigilant to these things, because as we saw in the case of David Ames last year, a single lone wolf can still wreak a huge amount of devastation.
And the particular circumstances that we've had in this country for the last 3 years, Alok, through the government, through people not being able to access healthcare, the cost of living going up and all the rest of it, those are, it seems to me, sort of perfect circumstances to grow mental health problems. And we know that, not to put too fine a point on it, most of these people who go around, with knives randomly stabbing at people have mental health problems, and they're looking for a cause.
Well, yes, and also the fact that if you're going to be the kind of person who's going to be radicalized in the UK, let's say, which has happened, then you're going to eventually want to travel to somewhere that's a training ground, which you've not been able to do for the last couple of years. So people all over the world, travel has stopped. And so you can't go to the training grounds. You can't do this sort of in-person radicalization. So their numbers must be, the numbers for IS must be depleted, because simply they don't have the bodies to actually fight their wars. And so this is an attempt to say, look, wherever you are in the world, whether it's America, Israel, the United Kingdom, whatever else, do your jihad there, but with no support or training or anything. And, in a way, we shouldn't be worried about the fact that people who may or may not know what they're doing, they're not going to be able to achieve the kinds of horrible terror attacks that we've seen in the past, thank goodness. But again, I repeat my point. I think that this doesn't mean it's not going to happen in the future.
And it thrives on fear, doesn't it, Kate? I mean, the real success that they had wasn't actually in the West. I mean, obviously, I'm not talking about Syria and Iraq, but in the West, the real success they had wasn't in claiming land or claiming followers. It was in making everyone else scared when they got on the underground that there might be a bomb. It's been over 10 years since I've been worried about that.
Yeah, that's exactly right, that a lot of it is based on fear. And I remember when there was the spate of terrorist attacks, I think it was in 2017, where it felt like there were lots in Europe in a very short period of time. And I remember going on the tube and feeling frightened, and, going to a shopping centre or a big, busy underground station, you would suddenly feel a bit more aware of your surroundings than you were beforehand. But then in the same way, when we don't have a terrorist attack for a while, those feelings kind of subside a bit. Similarly to COVID, I would say. The UK lowered its terror threat from severe to substantial earlier this year, meaning that a terror attack is still considered likely, but it's not as concerning as it was last year. And it had actually been risen following the 2 terror attacks, the stabbing of MP David Amess, and then also the bomb that was set off outside Liverpool Women's Hospital.
Yes. I mean, actually, Liverpool Women's Hospital is an interesting one, isn't it? And so is the Manchester Evening News Arena. I mean, maybe I gave a bit of a London-centric view there, Joe, when I was talking about not being scared on the underground. Maybe I'd feel differently if I was from Manchester. But it seems to me, when I've been to Manchester, that there's actually a sort of local resilience that's built up in response to those kinds of attacks. That's the other thing, isn't it? If people don't react by being scared, but by just saying, oh, he was a nutter, you sort of lose your power of the statement as well.
No, that's quite right. And I think also that is playing out within places like Whitehall. I think there is a time that I speak to people in the Home Office occasionally, and there's a time that this kind of call would have set off alarm bells for people working in places like the Home Office. I, out of interest, reached out to a couple of people before we recorded this, and the reaction.
What, actual journalism?
Actual journalism. I know, it's unheard of on this podcast. No, I'm kidding. The reaction from them was, like I've just said, proportionate vigilance, but kind of no massive panic. And I think that does speak to the fact that, a decade of no major terror attack in, the UK's capital city, and it being quite a long time since we've seen the sort of scenes we saw in Paris or in London in 2017 means that fear has to a degree dissipated at the same rate roughly to the sort of caliphate dissipating in the Middle East.
Yes, but I suppose if it is going to start up again, it's going to start up like this. So thanks for bringing it to us. Okay, Alok, you're up next after this.
Brought to you by Aria Resorts Homes, providing holiday homes and staycation investments. Aria Resorts sell luxury holiday homes in top UK locations, with a potential 7% annual net return available to qualifying investors at our flagship resort in Cornwall. Terms and conditions apply. Find out more by searching Aria Resorts Investment.
Right, Alok, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
A new type of global arms treaty.
I am pleased to announce that as of today, the United States commits not to conduct destructive, direct, ascent, anti-satellite missile testing. Simply put, these tests are dangerous, and we will not conduct them.
Vice President Kamala Harris there, speaking very slowly at the Vandenberg Space Force Base in California. Alok, what was she talking about?
So she's talking about what she called direct ascent anti-satellite missile tests. They're called ASAT tests. And these are essentially missiles that are fired from the ground directly into the low Earth orbit to destroy something like a satellite, for example, rather than doing the normal thing where, you send a satellite into orbit, something into orbit, and then it goes around the Earth. So these are technologies that have been around for several decades in 4 countries: America, China, India and Russia have conducted these sorts of tests. And they've been done mainly as a show of force. Russia did one in November last year, which was widely condemned around the world. What it did was to launch a missile at one of its own satellites to show that it could destroy it.
And that's been the case with all four of those countries, isn't it? They've destroyed their own satellites to prove they have the technology.
Yes, that's right. And you think, well, so what? So it can destroy its own satellite. Well, number one, if it can destroy its own satellite, it can destroy your satellite, And we know that satellites are incredibly important for all sorts of things on Earth, whether it's Earth observation, army communications, GPS, etc. And increasingly, there's an industry in space that wants to have satellites up there. And the problem with these sorts of satellite tests is that, okay, one, you can destroy your satellite, and that's not good for military operations. Number two, when you destroy a satellite, it creates tens of thousands of pieces, hundreds of thousands of pieces of debris. And that debris will then orbit the Earth for maybe decades or hundreds of years. And, it doesn't take a lot at that sort of level to destroy other satellites. Like a little piece of metal the size of a 2p coin can sort of rip a hole in another satellite.
Yeah, Kate, Russia's direct ascent missile caused a bit of rupture on the International Space Station, didn't it?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So after Russia conducted this test, at least 1,632 pieces of debris were thought to go into orbit. And when it happened, astronauts who were aboard the International Space Station actually had to seek shelter, which disrupted their work and I'm sure was extremely frightening as well. It's to do with the velocity with which the debris moves. It moves in a way which means it could easily puncture the walls of the station and cause a lot of damage and destruction. So not only could it threaten the lives of the astronauts who were in space at that time, but it can also have huge ramifications for vital services, like Alok mentioned, like GPS and telecommunications, weather warnings, all that kind of thing. I actually read on The Conversation that a GPS outage could cost the US specifically up to $1 billion a day. So there's also a huge economic cost as well for the people back home on Earth.
I'm dyspraxic. A GPS outage would cause thousands of dyspraxics like me to just drive into walls. But Joe, the US coming out now and saying, this is terrible, in reaction to what Russia did, basically. Is it a fig leaf for, doing something about Russia when doing something about Russia-Ukraine would be much more impactful but also much more consequential?
I think there's certainly kind of, foreign policy considerations to anything that gets said shortly after another country does precisely the thing you're banning. But I think there's also just a wider issue here, really, that these missile tests do jeopardize the sort of long-term sustainability of space, really, and imperil exploration and the use of space by countries. NASA estimates that there's about 23,000 objects larger than 4 inches, 500,000 larger than half an inch, and 100 million smaller than that currently orbiting around the Earth. And there's all kinds of stuff, dead spacecraft and used rocket boosters, lost gear from space missions. NASA specifically says a glove, a camera, a blanket, a wrench, and somehow a toothbrush are floating around up there. And all of this stuff obviously makes it harder in the future to launch satellites. They imperil future exploration missions. And so essentially the issue is that space is getting to become a bit of a mess, and that if we don't put a stop to it, that could potentially reduce our ability to use and exploit space in the way that we would like to in the future.
But Alok, would the US realistically have been doing another, because they've done one already, missile test against a space satellite anyway? They've tested, they've got the technology, they know it works. Why would they need to do another test? It's easy to say once you've done it, isn't it? We won't do any more tests.
I think this is the beginning of a long conversation, right? It's not an opportune moment to be sitting down with Russia to talk about the end of these sorts of tests. But think about things like the nuclear weapons treaties in the Cold War. There have to be ways of thinking about global security, global long-term security and trade and commercial opportunities and things, even with your enemies. So this is not going to transform Russia overnight, but it could lead to something where over many years, maybe even a decade, it will take to actually begin these sorts of conversations where we all countries realize that it's in everyone's best interest not to deploy these sorts of tests, in the same way that even Russians in their insane situations that we're in now probably realize that nuclear weapons are not a good idea. It's been inculcated over many decades.
Well, but hold on, this is the tests. It's not the actual attack. It's not saying if Russia attacked one of our satellites, we wouldn't retaliate and attack one of theirs. It's just a test, and they've done the test, is my point.
Well, the tests are, you don't just do one test, you keep doing tests. That's the whole point of improving technology and working out how to. Rocket science is complicated stuff. It changes and it's complicated. So you need to change the different rockets you're using. There's reasons to do multiple tests continuously as you improve your technology. I think the worst case scenario that America and others are worried about is something called the Kessler syndrome. If you've ever seen the film Gravity, that's what happens at the beginning of Gravity, where one cloud of debris essentially orbits the Earth and destroys everything else in slow motion over time in that same orbit. That means that entire orbit around the Earth is unusable for maybe 100 years. Now, so what you think? Well, the thing is, if you can't get anything into that particular orbit, say low Earth orbit where Earth observation satellites are or where GPS satellites are, then you can't. I mean, it's just physics. You can't do anything in that orbit for 100 years, and therefore, it completely ruins the space age that we were kind of used to, and that's useful for everyone. I mean, even Russia can acknowledge, and India can acknowledge that this is something that we don't want to ruin.
But also there's the commercial side, isn't there, Kate? So much of what's being launched into space this year privately benefits American companies, doesn't it? Amazon are launching their own satellites this year, obviously all of Elon Musk's stuff, which is all about bringing internet to the world, they say, but through their own corporate entities. It just seems sort of unimaginable to me that at some point Russia or China wouldn't want to take down one of those satellites. It's going to happen, isn't it? And then missiles will be sent up.
I mean, the way we're going, we're only going to be putting more and more up into space, it seems. There's so much investment going on in that area. The fact that there are these private companies now sending people into space. So yeah, certainly it's this area where we're going to see so much development. And that's why I think this is so concerning. I really couldn't help but draw parallels between what's happening with Alok's story and what's happening with climate change at the moment. The fact that countries have polluted the world for such a long time and now in this really terrible situation where it feels like it's almost irreversible, but at the same time countries don't really have individual kind of incentives to clean stuff up, and because of that no one really seems to be taking responsibility for the situation that the earth is in. And it made me feel slightly depressed to think about the fact that we can see the similar thing happening in space right now. Countries doing their own thing, polluting other orbits, not worrying about the consequences. And then again, it's going to be future generations that will have to pick up the mess. So I think it's really important what the US has done to take this stance. And I hope that other countries follow suit, because I think that we need to be taking action right now before this situation becomes worse and worse, as we've seen with global warming and climate change.
Yeah, one of the consequences, Joe, that I wasn't aware of with space debris is that it can block your view of the night sky, that the world might actually look different, or, space might look different from the world as a result of this.
Yeah, I'm not sure that anybody in London would necessarily notice if the view of the night sky was blocked. I don't think I've seen a star in about 7 years since I moved here. I think there are parallels between everything we've just discussed here in terms of Olly, you raising the case of sort of, arms races and nuclear arms races between powers on Earth, Kate's point about climate change and Alok's story. We sort of have been here before in terms of having a race to do something and invent something and absolutely destroying the environment in doing so. And that's the atomic race. There was, I think, around 70 bombs or something exploded over the Marshall Islands in the US attempt to create the first nuclear bomb, and it ruined the environment. And you would like to think that what this is a recognition of the fact that previous attempts to race to a milestone, in that case splitting the atom and creating a nuclear bomb, have ruined the natural environment in the process, and that the US in this next race to the milestone of space exploration and further exploitation of space doesn't want to repeat the same mistakes.
I mean, what's interesting to me, Alok, is the inclusion of India in the list of countries that have done it. That suggests to me that it's, a badge of pride if you can get to the stage where you can do this too. And there's lots of other countries in that kind of list, aren't there, that might just ignore what Kamala Harris is saying.
Space and capability in space is a sign of power and technological prowess, which is why we had the space race between the Soviets and the US, which is why India, China, everyone has a space agency, sending probes to Mars and all those things. It shows that you're a country that's technologically advanced and therefore economically advanced. So the fact that India's done it, shown that its space agency is something to be taken seriously. That's what it's doing. But it doesn't also want to fall foul of American policy. So it's already said after its own ASAT test that the debris it created actually came down, would have come down several months later rather than years later because of the particular orbits in. So even if it's not going to stop India or others from doing those tests, the thing is now there is a feeling in the world that there's someone watching you and telling you not to do it, and that these sorts of diplomatic sort of cudgels do have some effect. It takes a long time, but they do have some effect. And I think actually, on the other side of this, why is America doing this? I mean, it's about signifying that, you know, it wants to be taken seriously, and it's the most important space power in the world, which it still is. But it's also a sort of a self-interested thing, because half of the space infrastructure up there is American, right? Whether it's companies or NASA or, you know, anything related to America. So therefore, if there are problems in space with debris, it's going to be mostly American things that are under concern. So, which kind of also makes me think right now that Russia is not going to be listening or caring about this stuff, because if it can take out a military satellite, then it's good for Russia. And bear in mind also that SpaceX has sent terminals for its Starlink internet communications service to Ukraine. So it's an odd time, but I think it's still good that America has made this announcement.
Okay, fascinating. Kate, you are up next after this. Okay, Kate, your turn. You're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Has climate change finally been put to the test?
Well, I think we think there's a gap in the curriculum at the moment that isn't encouraging a connection with the natural world. At the same time, we know that young people are very much engaged on the debate on the environment, and they understand what their role should be and could be in protecting for the future.
Jill Duffy, Chief Executive of Exam Board OCR, speaking to the Cambridge Assessment podcast. That was a couple of years ago, Kate, in 2020. She was saying there's a gap in the national curriculum. Has that gap just been filled?
Yeah, so I thought for my topic this week, it'd be interesting to discuss the announcement of a launch of a new GCSE on natural history, which aims to teach children about the importance of the natural world and how to conserve the planet. And this announcement's followed more than 10 years of campaigning by people like nature writer Mary Calwell, and people like Chris Packham, Sir Tim Smith, who's the co-founder of the Eden Project, the former Green Party leader Caroline Lucas, and organisations like the Natural History Museum. Colwell actually said in an interview that she was laughed at when she first suggested introducing the qualification in 2011. So you can see how far things have come. And this is actually the first significant new GCSE that's been introduced in 5 years following a reform of the GCSE system. And it will be available from 2025.
Yeah, because that's the thing, isn't it, Joe? People thinking, well, what's the big deal? You know, they must introduce GCSEs all the time. As Kate just said, they don't. And I suppose if children choose them, because there are some you have to do, aren't there, like maths and science, just like it was when we were at school. When people choose the ones they want to do, this is going to sit alongside some pretty big subjects. People will be choosing, for example, natural history over history or geography. So it's got to be a serious contender for children's education.
Yeah, so I think the thinking here is that there's a sort of emerging industries and emerging jobs within the environmental sector that the sort of school setup as it stands doesn't prepare you for necessarily, or doesn't prepare you for at that age. The idea is that this will sit alongside those existing subjects you've just talked about in terms of, you know, obviously we learn about urbanization in geography and we learn about animal habitats in science. The idea, I guess, is that this will sort of plough a line through the middle of those two subjects, for example, and sort of go further in terms of teaching about the evolution of species and the impact of urbanization on natural environments, insofar as to not only inform children about the sort of natural world, but also to have that key element, which is about conservation, which I don't think necessarily gets taught quite so extensively at the moment.
Yeah, Alok, your scientific education, I imagine, was second to none. Would you have done with this in your GCSE portfolio, do you think?
Yeah, I'm always for any sort of qualification sort of takes into account sort of the way that we understand the world today. And I think that it's definitely good. But I suppose my caveat is that, my caveat is what does it replace? What's the opportunity cost of this? So if you're taking a GCSE in climate change, which I'm sure would be very interesting and, as someone who reports on climate change all the time, I think it's incredibly important that kids know about it. What does it replace? Is it stopping you from doing something like history, as you say, or geography, which are also important things? So that's one of my concerns. The other one is what's actually in the GCSE. I mean, are we talking about things like physical atmospheric physics or urban geography, or are we talking about things like animal evolution and stuff? These are all science topics that are covered in normal science GCSEs, one would think. So I wonder how you sort of manage that. Having said all that, I do think that science education generally is a little bit sort of siloed, and that if you can find stories across different sciences that take you across different sciences to understand and put things into context for you in the real world around you, that's not a bad thing. I do think that if you're going to try and do jobs and everything, though, you do need more specialization in whether it's physics or whatever else afterwards. A climate change degree, I'm not sure where that would take you necessarily.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it, Kate, that Alok is referring to this as a climate change GCSE. It isn't. It's a GCSE in natural history. Some of the press that's been out this week has sort of implied it's essentially a qualification in Greta Thunberg. But it isn't, is it? There's quite a lot to natural history. What have they outlined?
Yeah, that's right. So there's not a ton of information about exactly what the course will entail quite yet, but a Department for Education spokesperson said that it would enable young people to learn about organisms, the environment and sustainability and gain a deeper knowledge of the world. So in practical terms, that might include lessons on understanding how to conserve local wildlife or even identify certain species. And basically, it's just about addressing the disconnect that a lot of people, particularly people living in urban environments, have with the natural world.
I suppose by academicising it, is that a word, Joe? What they're doing is turning it into something that can be measured, like all GCSEs, and turning it into something where you read primary sources and all the rest of it. But I just wonder whether there's children, because we're talking about kids here, 14 and 15-year-olds, that might benefit from learning about this subject in a more practical, hands-on way than this. I mean, you can make your own compost, can't you? And inadvertently learn lots of things about sustainability without having to sit an exam on it.
Yeah, I take your point. I guess the position that the Department of Education, I imagine, would take, I haven't asked them, but I imagine the position they would take would be...
This is where your journalism lets you down, Joe. You see, you do the research for one story, we can expect it for all of them.
That's it. So I didn't speak to any Department of Education sources because I have none, because I never write about them. But I guess their position would be it's quite hard to assess, making a compost and wandering around a forest lifting up logs and looking for bugs underneath. I think one of the ways that I did wonder whether this would be a good thing, and it is purely speculation, I suppose, is that we know from polling numbers that young people are more worried about climate change than older people and the impact of human beings on the environment. We also know that girls tend to be more worried about it than boys. And so I did slightly speculatively have the question as to whether or not, if this opens up a generation of girls to STEM subjects, things that they're traditionally less interested in, then perhaps that would be a really positive legacy of this new GCSE subject, sort of large numbers of girls signing up and then going on because they become interested to study science at A-level or university.
Do you know, I think, having heard everyone else talking about this, the one thing about GCSEs that we can look back upon them and think is beneficial is that to me, the most important thing about the GCSEs is not the exam itself, but just what kinds of ideas and parts of the world it introduces to you for then one of which you might find particularly interesting, and then you go off and find and do further study, and maybe that becomes your career. So if it turns out that a natural history GCSE introduces people to a range of scientific subjects, welfare subjects, builds a bit more of a deeper connection with what's going on in the world and human impacts, that's no bad thing at all. For then you might then decide, do you know what, I'm really interested in the atmosphere and why it does this thing, or I'm really interested in zoology, all these things, which normally you might have had to do different GCSEs to do all those different things. Whereas here, there's a story around it. There's something that's more practical. And I think that in that sense, it could be quite an interesting gateway into a whole bunch of interesting subjects.
I mean, Kate, this has been so broadly welcomed, hasn't it, across politics. But I have seen some commentators effectively saying it's a missed opportunity if you're going to come out as Education Secretary and make a big statement about GCSEs. This isn't big enough. This is a thing everyone can agree about. But actually, maybe during the pandemic, with 2 to 3 years of a massive shift in education, that would have been the time to talk about changing GCSEs completely, making them a lot more diverse, taking away such a rigorous exam element, etc. Do you think that conversation is still going to happen?
Yeah, so I mean, there's been a conversation going on for a while about whether or not GCSEs are still fit for purpose. And as you said, that was kind of rumbling along during the pandemic. But actually, if anything, the use of teacher assessment instead of exams in 2021, it showed that the gap was kind of widened between private and state schools. So actually people use that as an argument to suggest that we shouldn't change the way that GCSEs are and make them more coursework based, which is what a lot of people had been calling for. So actually that argument is kind of continuing, and there hasn't really been a conclusion with it. And there are definitely problems with the system, like the unprecedented grade inflation that we've seen over the last couple of years. In August last year, a record number of school pupils achieved top grades in their GCSEs following the cancellation of exams for the second year in a row. And grades just can't keep rising and rising. I mean, it's going to reach a cap at some point. So, rather than whether or not we should scrap GCSEs, I feel like the conversation is a bit more now about how we can amend the marking system so it's fairer. For example, using a system which grades by numbers rather than letters, for example.
Most people don't leave school at 16 anymore, do they, Joe? So you do kind of wonder why spend those last 2 years of that bit of your schooling focused on exams when you're then inevitably going to sit another exam in a subject you've actually chosen for either your A-levels, if you go on to that, or some kind of diploma or in-work study or apprenticeship. What's the point? All you're learning is revision.
Well, I think what Alex said earlier is true of GCSEs, isn't it? That the exam at the time feels like the be-all and end-all for lots of people because it's the most important exam they'll have done that far in their education. But actually, as you say, most people don't leave school at 16. And so the more important thing is that it exposes you to lots of new ideas. And, if you study English literature, you might need to read a new writer. Or if you study history, you might study a new period that you've never really been exposed to before. And if it leaves you with a sense of passion for that thing, then that's obviously an excellent thing going on into your further education. I think what I find quite interesting about the conversation about whether GCSEs are fit for purpose is that a conversation we have far less often in the UK is whether A-levels are fit for purpose. And if you compare them to things like the International Baccalaureate and the way that things work in a country like Germany, where you do what's called an Abitur, you continue to study a huge range of subjects up until the age of 18. The thought process being that people age 16 shouldn't be making decisions about what they want to do at university because they're 16, and it may well change over the next 2, 5, 8, 10 years. And I think actually that is a question that we talk about a lot less in the UK, and I would like to see it talked about more, because I think it is a slightly reckless and short-sighted idea to have 16-year-olds making subject choices that could affect their prospects for the rest of their lives.
Okay, but it's the end of the show and I need to ask a glib question, so we're not going to ask a big broad-ranging debate like that. I'm just going to say, Alok, if you had to choose a GCSE that isn't on the syllabus, what would it be?
God, that's a hard question, isn't it?
4 seconds to think about it. That's it.
That's harder than answering the question of whether we should reform A-levels, I think.
That is a really hard question, but I've always thought it would be really helpful to have DIY on the curriculum. I feel like I lack so many kind of basic skills and have had to teach myself, even things like changing, sorting a puncture on a bike, that kind of thing I would feel would be so useful to learn at school. I don't know how you would necessarily assess that with an exam, but I do think these life skills should be taught.
Go on, Alok, I can see you've been inspired now.
I think anything to do with money, how to manage money.
Personal finance, yeah.
Just
That's another one.
even 6 months of like, how do you pay tax? Well, maybe a bit later on, but just how what savings are, all those sorts of things. Why eventually you might want to have a pension, all these sorts of things which you think about in your 40s terrifyingly. I've not had enough time to do this at all.
And go on, Joe, this is where you say something worthy like suffrage or citizenship or something.
I know I'd go opposite end of the scale and have a sort of School of Rock Jack Black style class where you just get put into rock bands.
That's already GCSE media studies, isn't it? Well, time's up, pens down. Congratulations, you have all passed this week's show. My thanks to Alok, Joe and Kate for their stories. And remember, you can follow this show, no GCSEs required, for free, and get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts. And do check out our sister show, The Overview, as well. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer, Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.